Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon online for the next presentation this term in our Animals in Society Research Initiative Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Manisha Deka, and I'm the Director of the Animal Society Research Initiative at the University of Victoria and housed at the Faculty of Law. We'd like to start off with a territorial acknowledgement to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university resides, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day and remain profound. We are grateful to be coming to you from these beautiful territories with the third installment of the Distinguished Lecture Series. Today's ASRI lecture is co-partnered by the Departments of English, Visual Arts, and Art History and Visual Studies at the University of Victoria. For information on our other lectures in this year's series, please visit our website, and Holly, our wonderful project coordinator, is posting the link on the chat now for you, as well as an email address for ASRI if you'd like to join our listserv and stay up to date with bi-monthly emails on news and events. Today, we are so pleased to welcome Dr. Evan Mwangi, whose talk is entitled Sexuality in African Animalities. His research examines the interface of animality in African art and ideas on non-normative sexualities. Professor Mwangi is Professor of English at Northwestern University and Professor Extraordinaire of English at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. His most recent publications include Translation in African Contexts, Post-Colonial Texts, Queer Sexuality and Cosmopolitan Fluency from 2017, and The Post-Colonial Animal, African Literature and Post-Human Ethics from 2019. He is at work on a monograph on animality in Indian Ocean cultures. We will have time following his presentation for a question and answer period, so please do post any questions in the chat, and I will read those out afterward and invite Professor Mwangi's responses. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Mwangi.
Thank you so much, Anisha, and thank you, Holly, for organizing this. I'm very honored to be here. And I'm gonna share, instead of reading a lecture to you over Zoom, I think what I'm gonna do is share some slides and highlight some of the arguments that I have about the topic, sexuality and African animalities, or sexualities and animality in African arts. And when Manisha invited me to give this talk, I was planning to go to the Indian Ocean in South Africa, where I have an appointment, but COVID-19 struck. Even before the lockdown, I decided not to travel at the time because I had upcoming classes. I couldn't travel. I'm on leave at the moment, but still I couldn't travel. Not because of the lockdown, but I'm also taking into account my own vulnerability in this situation. So what I'm gonna do is give you a sense of some of the arguments that I have in my book. And although this work is already published, I consider it to be work in progress. So I'm keen to hear your questions and advice, because I'm writing two essays, one on veganism in African literature and another one on animal studies in African contexts. So this is fairly, although the argument, is captured in the book, I'm going to introduce new materials as we go along. And this is the book that was published in 2019, last year by Michigan University Press. And I'm gonna discuss some of the considerations that I have when I study African animality and when I study sexuality in African context. And I'm also going to discuss this image by Wangeshi Mutu about the entanglement between humans and the animal. The reason I focused on animals and why I'm really interested in animality and animals is that when I ask my students at the beginning of class what comes to their mind when they hear the word Africa, the majority of them say animals. Or Black people, that's 5%, soccer, deserts. Nobody even talks about oceans. That's why I'm also interested in the Indian Ocean, which is quite silenced in African literary studies. Yet, even if we associate Africa with animals, there are no studies of animals in African literature, or rather, even if there is, they're not systematic. And there's a sense in which animal studies, especially in the West, replicate some of the weaknesses it criticizes Western societies for, including racism. It's not that people in animal studies in the West do not discuss African literature, but they limit themselves to white African writers such as Cozier, sometimes Barbara Catlard, sometimes Barbara Kingsolver. The Black writers are ignored. And I want us to go beyond, I would urge us to go beyond the white writers, beyond Cozier. He's not the only writer that talks about animals. You know, almost all African literature is about animals, animality, such that when I was writing the book, my dilemma was which texts to use and which not to include, because almost all of them would be relevant for the project. So I chose those ones that have not been studied in detail and reading them in relation to the ones that have been discussed. Even if when I ask my students what they think about, when they hear the word Africa, they talk about animals. I grew up in rural Kenya, in rural central Kenya, but I've never seen any of those animals. I've never seen a lion. My eyesight is pretty bad, but if I had, I had crossed the path with an elephant, I would have seen it. But I've never seen those animals. They only exist to most Africans in game reserves. And here I am in a game reserve, having fun with the giraffes. Today I would not do this. At the time I think I was still writing the book, but I was not consciously vegan at the time, in which we were imitating, performing intimacy with the giraffes. In fact, I have one of the pictures in which I'm kissing the giraffe. I did not include it here because there are other people in the frame who have not, from who I do not, they're tourists, other tourists, and I haven't asked them for permission to reproduce their images. So I do not have it here, but we perform intimacy with animals in game reserves. Today, because of my vegan, at the time I was vegan, but I wasn't aware of it, a vegan and conscious. But today I would not go to game reserves, and I was taking some American friends whose kids wanted to see animals. So we decided to go to Karen Blixen Museum and Giraffe Center for them to interact with the animals. In dealing with animals, in the book and in the project that I'm working with, I'm following the footsteps of a few Africanists, where the Woodward is probably the only scholar in African literature who has studied animals in detail in this book, Animal Gaze, which I really recommend. But she does not discuss sexuality, which is central to my work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, how the animality intersect with the marginalized sexualities in Africa. Fatima Mola's book is a collection of essays, very diverse selection of essays, some of which discuss oral literature, how, for example, the pastoralist communities, such as the Maasai and the Samburu, take care of the animals, communicate with the animals. Kajetani Hekas, I think, is it is not an animal studies book. It is more of ecology, but it makes an important point that when we study the non-human in African literature, we should not ignore the human, because sometimes we, we tend to focus too much on the environment, and while the Africans themselves are not considered human, and they're still struggling to be included in the realm of the human. Harriet Garuba too, a very beautifully written essay, which I would highly recommend. I haven't used it in the book, but this is one of the essays that show how the West views Africa as antithetical to modernity, as antithetical to human. So Africa has always been thought in terms of the non-human. Actually, there's somebody who calls Africans non-human humans, in the sense that they're not considered fully into that realm of the humanity. And Byron Santangelo, right, who worked from an African ecological perspective. And the important thing to note about these books is that they emphasize that the eco-criticism of the global South is different than the eco-criticism in the West, in the sense that one, the environment is seen as anti-colonial it is involved in the fight against colonialism. This is a new book, Joshua Bennett's, about Blackness, African-American literature, the use of animal motifs in African-American work. John S. Beatty, probably most of you, especially those of you who are in religion, know him. He's the one who came up with this argument that Africans are notoriously religious. And I use him in my work in the sense that he shows us how Africans use animals as in animal sacrifices. So he's not vegan. Actually, he's very much anthropocentric. And I critique him firstly because even his name Biti, is his mother tongue Kamba, the Kamba language for the hyena. Yet he seems to see humans as superior to animals in his writing on African religions and philosophy. And he's called a Biti in his culture because the hyena would protect him. It is an invocation of the hyena to protect him against death, against illness. So all those malevolences would be scared away by the hyena. And when people like Hemingway visited the Cumberland, where Biti comes from, they would, I think, Hemingway mentions the killing of hyenas. The Kabas were killing hyenas, but Kaba scholars have contested that. It is very rare for a Kaba person to kill a hyena because you are not killing the hyena to eat it as food. And they respect that animal. So Ernest Hemingway, in his representation of the Kaba, the relationship between the Kaba and Biti, the hyena, has been strongly critiqued in Kamba post-colonial studies. Of course, I use Fanon. It's very rare to use, and who to talk about. It's very rare to talk about post-colonialism in Africa. Anything about Africa, the African humanity, the African animal, without considering Fanon, who in many sections of his black skin, white masks, mentions how the African is seen as an animal by especially the colonialist. So sometimes the African also wants to define himself against, or the Africans want to define themselves in terms of how they are not animals. So like the classical Ubuntu philosophy, when it began, the scholars, the philosophers the, were defining the human in terms of how the human is different than the animal, but the Ubuntu scholar have moved away from that by saying the connection between the human and the animal. To be a muntu, to be a human being, you have to respect the animals. In fact, even calling for the end of animal sacrifices, where people would kill animals in order to connect with the ancestors. So Fanon is extremely important in my work, and I'd be happy to talk about him a little bit in Q&A. But notice how in Black Skin, White Mask, even the word animal, features throughout. Of course, Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask says that homosexuality does not exist in post-colonial societies. But I would want us to read Fanon as a literary text, because Fanon is very cheeky. He makes those statements in footnotes, and that footnote in the comparison, it appears as if homosexuality is much more common than the colonialism that he is talking about. So he uses homosexuality as the vehicle in a metaphor. And in a metaphor, the vehicle is the much more well-known thing. So he suggests at the same time that homosexuality is part and parcel of post-colonial cultures. So I do not ignore it. When I read the African text, I am attentive to the way the text represents non-normative sexualities in the use of animal motifs. I'm also inspired by Wangari Maathai, whom as a student at the University of Nairobi, I interacted with in demonstrations and protests for the environment and animals. Remember, she's the first woman in Eastern Africa to have a PhD. She was a veterinarian, but she's much more known today for her work in the protection of forests. So, but her training is in animals, and she says that we owe it to ourselves and to the next generation to conserve the environment and respect animals for the sustainability of the world. Throughout my work, I pay attention to what I'm calling the interconnection, the intersectionality, and mainly following Braidotti. And I must qualify that when I discovered Braidotti quite recently. There are people that accuse me of using Western theorists, because there are people who say, as an African, I should give priority to the African scholars. What am I doing working with Braidotti as a framework? But I do not follow that kind of tradition, because I think we would be giving Western theories more credit than they deserve, in the sense that these ideas are not necessarily Western. There is a Luo scholar, Peter Amuka, who has read Luo proverbs and realized that most of them are talking like Derrida. So the construction is not necessarily an African, because even within pre-colonial cultures, and he would pick a proverb and show the way it relates, or a Derridian concept and the way it relates to an African proverb. So even when I use Braidotti, is not necessarily as a Western scholar, it's because her ideas would resonate in many parts of the world. Actually, I discovered Braidotti in maybe the fourth draft of my work. I had already written the book. Then I think I was trying to, because it has the term post-human, so I was trying to give a definition of the post-human, and that's how I I bumped into Braidot's work and realized we were making almost a similar kind of argument. So I reviewed her and incorporated her in my project. And the point that she's making here is that we should see the interconnection between, say, greenhouse effect, the status of women, racism, xenophobia, and consumerism, rather than discuss one in isolation of the other. So when I read the animal, because I also know there might be backlash when you just focus on the animal, I consider other aspects of African culture that intersect with animal culture. And that's the way people like even Kajetani Heka have been urging us to do. When we talk about the environment, it should not be in isolation of the human beings, the oppressed in post-colonial cultures. Probably some of you have read Binyavanga Wainaina, who is mocking these Western habits of prioritizing the animal at the expense of the human. So here he's being sarcastic, that if you want to be accepted by Western presses, if you want your stories to be published and to win prizes, please leave out Africans in your story. Just focus on the animals, have round characters, but make sure that if there is any African in your work, you know, they are the noble savages in pre-colonial culture. And again, I think the point that he's making here is that when we talk about the animals, it should be in relation to the humans in especially oppressed cultures. And Binyavanga Wainaina, again, he was one of the most prominent, he passed away a few years ago. He was one of the most prominent writers from Africa to come out as gay. When he wrote this, he hadn't accepted, you know, openly his sexuality, but later on he came out as a gay writer. And so even when we read about animals, it should be in relationship to sexualities as well. Again, and there's so many, almost all writers emphasize this. This is Nuruddin Farah from Somalia. I think some of you must have read him, especially people in English. He's the author of Maps. This is from Hiding in Plain Sight, in which he says that freedoms come as a package deal. You cannot have freedom of expression without freedom of religion. You cannot have freedom of association without freedom of expression. All of this must be seen in intersection with one another. And he also mentions queer sexuality, you know, just after making this statement. And I think the statement is also seen in context of normative sexuality, that you cannot have freedom of expression while you are oppressing gay people in African cultures. Again, the point emphasized here is the need to look at all these things in relation to one another. I try very much, because of my location in the Western Academy, to incorporate African voices in African languages. People like Nuruddin Farah, who write in English, have been accused of trying to propagate ideas in their novels in English that would be acceptable in Western societies. He has even been, he's Muslim, but he has been accused of even Islamophobia, that he injects in his novels Islamophobia because the West is Islamophobic, so the West would like his books. He's one of the people that are perennially mentioned as contenders for the Nobel Prize for Literature. So he's one of the prominent writers, and you know, he'll be accused all the time of the tendency to write in a way that is acceptable to the West. But we hear the same argument in Swahili literature, in African texts. This is a text that is not likely, it has not been translated into English. And the author, Chachage, the novel is called Makuari wa Soko Huria, which my translation is Pimps of the Free Market. It says that as intellectuals, we have to emphasize ule umoja wa binadamu, ng'ombe, wanyama wa pori na misitu ambao ni tunu lililokabidhiwa na Mwenyezi Mungu, na kawambia Edeni ulimwenguni mukaishi kwa busara ya utegamano. Go into the world and live in interdependence. And he's saying that we need to care about the environment, the humans, the wildlife, domestic animals. Here he mentions the Almighty God, but it is not the Almighty. The book is written from a Marxist perspective. He's a socialist. Actually, it is dedicated to Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, the founding president of Tanzania, who was a socialist. And as you can guess, a socialist book, a Marxist book, is very critical of religion as the opium of the masses. So he even presents the religious people, evangelists the evangelicals in a very negative way. So here when he mentions about the Almighty God, it is not the God of the West. It is the animist God of Africa who needs people to live in harmony with one another, in interdependence with the non-human elements as well. So the point here is that we need, especially to consider the African languages, because Chachage is not writing for the Western audience the way we may accuse Nuruddin Farad to be doing, yet he's emphasizing the same idea of interdependence between the human and the animal. And remember Goge's, I think Goge's argument is very well known in post-colonial studies, decolonizing the mind, that African literature can only be written in the languages of the peasantry and the working classes. So you cannot, I think here sometimes Goge is misread, because in the Western Academy, we tend to reduce some complex argument into a maxim, like Goge is saying that people should not write in languages other than African languages, but he's just emphasizing the need to write in African languages, languages that communicate with the ordinary people in the world. So I'm very much influenced by Goge's argument in the incorporation of African language text. I also tend to be careful because I went to school in Nairobi. That's where I did my undergraduates. That's where I did my PhD. And most of my lecturers, most of my professors were hired specifically to reduce the stature of Goge, because he was critical of the government. And they were hired to clean the department of the Goge ghost. So as you can imagine, those professors taught us to hate Goge indirectly. So when I do this kind of work, I'm also acknowledging and correcting some of the things that I have done in the past, where I think I even developed my career attacking Goge. Well, Goge is making a very important point that you cannot write about African literature and ignore literatures in African languages. And those literatures also talk about animals, and we'll explain a little further that usually interest in animals is stereotyped as an interest of white people. It is Europeans that are interested in animals because they hate human beings, so they pretend to like dogs and cats to compensate for that hatred they have for and yet African texts, even in African languages, are about animals. And Wangari Maathai again, the Nobel Prize winner, emphasizing that we need to take care of the animals because today we do not, in contemporary Kenya, people do not know how to respond when they interact with animals. And she mentions, we come from the same clan for some reason, or rather her name comes from the Gikuyu word for leopard. You know, she's Wangari Maathai, Wangari the leopard, one who comes from the leopard. And she mentions instances in which I remember as a kid, we were also taught, like if you come across a leopard, that you can talk to the leopard and the leopard would not attack you. You just bypass each other in peace. And I suspect even if my eyesight is bad and I never saw leopards, I think they were seeing us without us seeing them because you could see the footprint of the animals, but you never saw the animal because it also gave you the space. It respected your space, and you should also respect the leopard's space. And Wangari Maathai mentions that quite a lot in her writing, the need to respect the environment in a way that is not destructive. So when you see the animal, you should not scare it. So I think that there were some songs that we are supposed to sing when you see the leopard, but mainly I think it was just to calm us down. When you see the leopard, do not panic. Just to sing this song, and probably the leopard will just go away and leave you alone. Look at Zex Muda again. This is the author who is has also been accused of writing in ways that would impress white people. And he says that caring about animals and telling stories about them cannot be a white thing because they are these are the very animals that features as characters in the stories that my grandmother told me when I was a little boy. And some of his critics, and they're praising him. They're not necessarily dismissing his work. They say Zex Munda has taken advantage of the fact that he was teaching at the time. He wrote most of his books. He was teaching at Ohio University. So they would praise him for learning from the Western society and giving animals more voice in their, but he's saying that this is not a white thing. It is something that Africans always do in their work. Gugu Wathiongo again, emphasizing the interaction, the interdependence between plants, animals, and humans in especially African orature, pre-colonial orature. And when I use African orature in my writing and in the essays that I'm doing, I usually try to see how the writers change them, because writers are not necessarily duplicating what pre-colonial artists used to do. They change them, they incorporate gender, sexuality, issues that the pre-colonial artists may not have been talking about. Usually I see the non-human who sometimes dies at the end of pre-colonial oral literature. The orature, especially the ogre. The ogre would die and people would be happy ever after. In modern stories, the ogre is recuperated. That non-human being is not killed. The ogre dies of a natural death. So in a way, these writers are not just duplicating oral literature, even if they're showing the interaction between these various elements, the human and the non-human, they're also injecting new perspectives, especially on gender and sexuality. Jim Chuchu, one of my favorite artists, he's not in the book. But especially, as I mentioned, when you look at African art, you wonder which one to incorporate when you're talking about, and all of them have this kind of influence. And here, Jim Chuchu, he takes photographs and then manipulates them. Here you can see this is like, they're like the horns of an antelope. They're also like plants. And the person is gazing into the cosmos. And see again, the same kind of presentation of the interface between the human, the animal, the plants. What is striking, and I would urge, especially those people who read visual art, to consider, is also references to non-normative sexuality in Jim Chuchu's work, especially those of us who study literature. We do not have the facility to discuss and show some of the nuances of Jim Chuchu's work. I look at it, I admire it, but sometimes I'm tongue-tied. What else do I say about this? But there are also references to gender and sexuality. I couldn't, for the sake of fair use, I could not reproduce some of the images, but they also show same-sex desire, especially between men. At the time he did this Pagans series, he also did a collection of essays on the voices of queer people in Kenya. He's one of the scholars, one of the artists that live openly as gay people in Kenya, where queerness is a crime, is still a crime under the law. So as we read him, it would be imperative to piece out the ways in which these gods that he presents, these are deities, the pre-colonial gods, the pre-colonial worshippers, the deities and their worshippers, how he injects non-normative sexuality at the same time. Wangeshi Mutu, the intertwined. This is the image I use, she gave me to use on the cover of my book. I don't know what you think about it. You know, these are like humans, they're animals, cross-species sexuality. You can see the relationship is also same-sex relationship. What I noticed is that people respond differently based on gender. Men did not like the image. Male scholars, male colleagues, Africanists, I asked them about the image. Actually, at some point, I almost pulled it out to use maybe Jim Chuchu's work because of the response of my male fellow male scholars. Others asked me to get rid of you may not see them, they may not be very clear in this, get rid of the desirous tongues, like cover, but Wangeshi Mutu had told me not to tamper with her image. And I'm glad I did, I produced it the way it is. I asked a few female scholars and they said, go ahead. This is the kind of images that we need to see more and more in African literature, which tends to be more anti-colonial. Like the most important texts are those that discuss colonialism, or when we read African literature, we look for the way in which the artist is representing the clash between Africans and the colonialists. Yet even the animals are very much part of that matrix. And Wangeshi Mutu emphasizes that in almost all her images. Very quickly, I'll mention some of the texts. I'm sure most of you have, some of you might have read these works. Nuruddin Farah, whom I mentioned earlier, who's been accused of writing in ways that would be amenable to the West. Maps, I think, is probably the most well-known of his books. Maps, which talks about the Ogden War, the arbitrariness of the boundaries in African continent, where the Somali are in Eritrea, they're in Ethiopia, they're in Kenya, and they're in Somalia. The Maasai are in Kenya and Tanzania because those boundaries were drawn in a very arbitrary way. What I look at in Nuruddin Farah's work is the representation of the animals in maps and secrets. And probably that's why some of the Somali scholars do not approve of him. He represents sex with human-animal sex. In maps, there are characters that have sex with chicken. In secrets, the same. And one of the characters, and it's much more developed in secrets, there's a character who has sex with cows. And he also represents male-male sexual relationships. And sometimes I'm wondering, is Nuruddin Farah homophobic? Because it tends to present the relationship between sexual relationships between animals and humans in a negative way, while we know interspecies sex is the most intense form of queer desire. But I would, in the book and in my future writing, I don't know whether people will contest this, I would argue that it's not necessarily homophobic. It is that the animals, we might be misreading animal consent. So the animals are seen to have consented to the sex, but maybe not. So he uses unreliable narrators to help us question the ways that we relate to the animals. Crossbones is a novel from the Indian Ocean. It doesn't have a lot of animals, but it shows the destruction of the Indian Ocean ecosystem is the one behind the rise of terrorism in Eastern Africa. Most arguments are that terrorism comes about because of Islamic fundamentalism, but Nuruddin Farah tells us no, it is because we have destroyed the environment and young people are easily influenced to join fundamentalist groups because fishing has been destroyed and other forms of livelihood in the culture. Saida Hagideri Hazi, I think most of you who have done African feminism have encountered her work, especially the short story called Against the Pleasure Principle. It is one of the stories that highlights the pain of female genital mutilation. Most writers, most African writers before Saida portrayed the issue, either would disnarrate it, such that there is female genital mutilation in Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which almost every learned person has read, but you're not going to be, unless you come from that culture, you may not notice any references to female circumcision in the work, because sometimes it is called taking a bath. She took a bath and then she got married, which means that she got circumcised and got, or sometimes these writers would be ambivalent, such as Gogo Wathiongo's The River Between. He presents, the difficulties of female genital cutting, but in an ambivalent way. You are not very sure whether he's condemning it or he's saying that the missionaries are wrong in fighting it. But this Somali author was one of the people to openly condemn female genital mutilation. Nuruddin Farah had written books that referred to female cutting. And in fact, because Nuruddin Farah is such a good writer, there are people that even believed that he's a man, but because of the name, especially in the West, people did not know whether it's a man or a woman. They assumed that he is a woman because of the way he sensitively represented female circumcision. So they would invite him to go and give talks on how he got the FGM. But it is Saida Hazi who really condemned it openly in her writing. But in Government by Magic, she's very ambivalent about animals, because the character that she presents there, the main character, is also abused. She has been misused by the system, but she has been co-opted to animals and use slaughterhouses to pollute the Indian Ocean. And I see a lot of ambivalence about that in African literature, where even Zex Mda, even if he's making this statement about animals, sometimes we are not very sure what position he takes in the work. I've mentioned Makwadi Wasoko Huria, Ibrahim Hussein. He's the most prominent dramatist from East Africa, and these works have been translated into English. And Clara Momanyi, they all show the importance of animals and the environment in African cultures. The main, most of the characters in these works are queer. If we define queerness in the sense, sexual desires and practices that undermine regimes of normative sexuality and mark all aspects of anti-contrast trait production and reception. And I get that from Alexander Doty. So the main character in Government by Magic Spell, it's a novel, it's a short story of disillusionment. Remember, African literature from the 1960s is about disillusionment. We have flag independence, but it does not translate into material freedom. And the main character there is queer in the sense that she cannot get married. She does not have any relationship with the men because she's possessed by genes, and they have certain names. So people would want to marry her, but should reject them. And it was generally agreed that she would not get married. She cannot be in a heterosexual relationship. So she's queer, but at the same time, she's this person who is being used by the system to exploit animals. Very quickly, I can just give you an example of a Swahili shairi. This is a typical Swahili poem. And as you can notice, it is usually 4 lines with rhymes in the first three lines. And another thing you should notice is that there is a rhyme in the middle before the medial pause. So, and each line is divided into 2, 8 stanzas, 8 stanzas, 8 syllables, 8 syllables. Each line has 16 syllables with a medial pause and an internal rhyme. So that's how all accepted Swahili poetry should be written. You have that structure, you just fit in your words into that kind of structure. Of course, there are new writers that have gone against this. They say it is colonial, it is restrictive, it does not give us the freedom to experiment with language. And remember, this must have been geniuses that wrote this poetry because most of them are not literate. So they would be composing them orally and following these strict rules that at the end of the line, you should have a rhyme orally. And sometimes they're spontaneous because they're competitions in which you talk about an issue and I give a counterpoint to that issue in live, oral, unplanned, spontaneous performances, yet still follow the same rule. What I noticed about this poetry is a tendency to use animals, especially insects, represent homosexuality. And most of the scholars, of Swahili scholars would, that have read this poem would say that it is not, they would insist that it is not about homosexuality, it's about female friendship, because the Swahili word for a female friend, now woman is describing a fellow woman, they would just call them shogayangu, shogangu. Like, so they would see this as a poem about a non-sexual relationship between women. But it is clear from the poem that's is talking about homosexuality, ushoga, vyake vitendo, ubongo hunivuruga. And from the description, you can see it's about male same-sex sexuality. And when you read these poems, you might think that they are homophobic too, in the way they make fun of homosexuality. But in East African contexts, where homosexuality is illegal, where people argue it does not even exist, to make this kind of statements is very radical. And they're saying, you know, homosexuality is like insects. So even if you do not like it, you have to live with it because there's nothing you can do about it, which is fairly radical in its presentation. Of course, today there are some poets such as Gashagua who have started writing about homosexuality openly and sensitively. I think we can, here I just wanted to show that when African writers mention animals, especially in a negative context, like Goge uses the Indian Ocean, Lake Victoria Railway Station, the East African Railway line, you know, keeps on mentioning the snake. And they would want to destroy the railway. But when it comes to destroying the railway, he makes sure that he does not mention the snake. He does not refer to it as a snake. When it is going to be destroyed, it becomes a railway. So the snake is just a metaphor, insisting that we are not talking about the real snake out there. Even if you destroy the railway, you should not destroy you should not kill snakes. The same thing with butterflies. Europeans are described as butterflies who should be, you remember Goge is panonist. He endorses the use of violence to fight colonialism. So it is okay to kill the colonialists, but he also emphasizes that the butterflies, you'd need to have very good skills to be able to uproot colonialism. So he makes sure that even if you're going to destroy the colonialists, the butterflies should be, the real butterflies should be left alone. I have mentioned the classic Swahili poem, this one, which has this structure. Shaban bin Robert is associated with that tradition. He's called the Shakespeare of the Swahili, the Shakespeare of Swahili literature. But notice there, he dispenses with that structure. Yet, like to write like this is to show that you're not very good in Swahili. But when it comes to the urgency of talking about animals, how they might be more complicated than we understand, Shaban bin Robert departs from that traditional structure. Yet, yes, he's using rhyme, but it is different than the strict rhyme scheme in a traditional Swahili poem. Frog, I want to understand you. Why are you so happy every time it rains? You laugh in the pods, you have no clothes to wash, you don't even have soap and don't have jerry cans. What will you do with the water? Again, showing us that we may not fully, we may think that we are superior to the frog, but the frog is much more complicated than we think. I want to talk about, very briefly, before a minute, before I close, about the considerations I have when I talk about gender sexuality in African contexts. I know even in Western literature, especially when one is talking about interspecies sexuality, people, you know, people do not want to talk about that because of the stigma towards that kind of practice, which people do not want to be associated with because it can lower your reputation in the Western academy. So I also have some considerations that I make, especially when talking about sexuality as an animal in African literature, especially because of the trolls. You can see Binyavanga Wainaina is that person that was saying that if you want to be accepted by Western audiences, you have to prioritize animals over humans. You can see trolls, and you know, this is a mild one. There are others that even threaten, said death threats. I don't think they would do it because usually it is not because of my academic work, usually it's because of my activism in the media, in the Kenyan media. But one has to be careful when writing about these ideas. No, it's important to write about sexuality, but there can also be backlash out there. I know students that have been banned from entering certain African countries because they are writing on, you know, normative sexuality. And usually it is not the countries that are openly homophobic. It is not like Uganda or Nigeria. It may be Tanzania, which you never hear being talked about in homophobic context, but I know students from Oxford, from Harvard, that have been denied entry into the country because of this. So the tendency, and sometimes I want to ask for forgiveness from my readers, is that when I talk about sexuality, it's like I'm talking about those things out there, which I'm not very part of, those gay people out there whom I'm reading from a distance because this is just academic work. So affecting objectivity as a survival mechanism. It is only in my third book, The Post-Colonial Animal, where you even hear my personal voice. You know, in the others, I want to talk about those people out there who do ABCD because I do not want to, you know, to be banned from certain contexts. Maybe with that, I'll stop here because I know you have a lot of questions, a lot of observations, but maybe last I could say that the animal, when I talk about the animal here and probably in the book as well, it's like I'm talking about a singular thing. Animals are treated differently, even in African literature. The hyena will be laughed at. For example, in Kikuyu culture, the hyena is greedy, that's why he limps, because he did not know whether to, the hyena felt the smell of meat, and he did not know whether meat came from this side or this side, so he decided to go astride, and therefore that's why the hyena limps. So some of the animals will be represented negatively, or the society would be ambivalent about the animal. For example, the hyena is also respected in the Kikuyu culture because the Kikuyu did not bury the dead. It is the hyena that took care of that. So there is respect for the hyena, but at the same time, you know, the culture is ambivalent about it. Maybe with that, I'll stop and allow you to ask me questions or comment about some of the texts that you have read.
Thank you so much, Professor Mwangi.
Thank you.
And as you are stopping your screen share, we'll,
okay.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
We will be delighted to take questions. So if you can, please put your question in the chat and I'll be very happy to read it out. And perhaps I will just, if I may, get going with some of the questions here, Evan.
Thank you.
So could you, it's just several, I mean, so many thoughts came up as you took us so deeply through your main intellectual points of engagement in the work. Can you just say more about, like, what is a major catalyst? Is there one, or has it been more an organic or iterative type of process for the response that caring about animals is Western, do you locate it as to kind of one main cultural development that has started this discourse? Is it more prominent in certain parts of the continent and not others? And then relatedly, just related now to that unfortunate, troll comment you showed, what do you perceive as the connection between that is coming from such critics or trolls between expressing intellectual arguments and care for animals with accusations, as it's put in the pejorative, of non-normative sexualities? What is the dynamic there? And I'm sensing it's related to both of these intellectual affective dispositions, caring for animals, expressing non-normative sexuality, as being stereotyped as Western.
Yeah, thank you. I think where the Woodward mentions South Africa, where the dogs were used very much in colonial contexts, in which the white settlers would use the dog. They had converted the dog into an ally for apartheid. So there's that tendency, the colonials, the way they used dogs, to see them as anti-African. And I guess even this has been captured in one of the scholars, Bennett Boiseron, who write about the Afro dog, the way the dog has been used in African-American context as that animal that is used by the police, the white police, to fight the Africans. So I'm not sure where the stereotype came from, because even when Ngugi wa Thiong'o revised his novel, his well-known novel, A Grain of Wheat, he had a version at 1960. It came out in 1967. Then he revised it 1986. And one of the scenes in which he changed was one in which Africans killed dogs, European dogs. Here in the original, the characters do not have any remorse. They just kill the dogs. They rape the white woman. But in the later version, they do not rape the white woman. And even if they kill the dogs, they try to show that they have killed those dogs because they belong to the white woman. They have been used by the white woman to fight the Africans. So he expresses that remorse, and it is seen as if Ngugi is writing that way because he's now located in the Western Academy. And the same stereotypes that homosexuality is Western, yet as Nuruddin Farah argues, every society, including African societies, have non-normative sexuality. Even if you're not talking about sex in coital terms, they have ways in which they undermine heteronormative perspectives. So I'm not very sure where this comes from. What I'm interested in is fighting that stereotype. And we won't fight it effectively when animal studies scholars, especially those who are based in the West, just focus on white authors, while almost all African writers write about animals, including there are some that even write stories from the dog perspective, like Patrice Ghana. The Dog Day is written from the perspective of a dog. I even had some Canadian texts, which, because I was writing the book as a post-colonial text, but the place where I could get someone to publish it was African perspective. I knew that would be an African perspective of Canadian literature, but I just removed some of those non-African texts from the book. Thank you. I hope that answers in some way.
Yes, thank you. All right, let me read the question because as Evan, as our speaker, cannot see them. So here we have another question in the chat. These authors serve as vectors of becoming, quote unquote, for human subjectivity, a la Deleuze and Guattari, more than as independent subjects of concern. Is that fair to say? If so, are there authors' texts where we see non-humans presented instead more as independent sources of value, i.e., or for example, more of a deep ecology perspective? If you'd like me to reread it, I'm happy to.
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful question, which I've been grappling with because most of the texts still prioritize the human, such that the animals are sometimes seen as stand-ins for human experiences. So these animals will be seen especially in terms of, colonial structures. Yet at the same time, the writers are trying to show that the animals have interests of their own. So when, say, Gannon writes his story from the perspective of a dog, or Mabuku writes from the perspective of a porcupine, the diary of a porcupine, it's a porcupine that is telling the story. Even if we read that story in human terms, it's also insisting that these animals have rights and perspectives of their own. Even a simple poem like that by Shaban bin Robert on the frog, it shows that the frog has its own perspective. It is we humans that may not be able to access it. I use the notion of becoming in the book, but mainly becoming vegan, in which I see veganism as a process in which these writers, even if they show that people are still eating meat in Africa, they see the ideal to be when we get rid of meat eating. In fact, there's one story within Inyonye, Don't Exploit Me, which it's based on oral narrative, Pokomo oral narrative from the Indian Ocean cultures, in which the ideal world, before we fell from grace, nobody was eating meat. People were not eating meat. No animal was eating another animal. All were equal in the cosmos. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Another comment, thank you for this rich overview of African authors, literature, and art. In your book, you describe your personal arc considering animal ethics and changing your diet to eliminate animal products. Concerns with climate change are reinforcing the need to shift to sustainable diets, reducing animal products. How do you observe this movement in Africa? Does this conflict with post-colonial perceptions of veganism as a white elite movement? I observe that so many African cultures have a lot to teach other cultures of their rich traditions of plant-based recipes. When you travel back to different cities, countries in Africa, do you observe attitudes embracing cultural traditions of plant-based diets from an ethical or environmental point of view? Do you observe more discussions about this at either the private or public level?
Thank you. Actually, I had a lot of opposition. I had the term vegan in the title of the book, but everyone told me to get rid of it because they were arguing that we do not even have the term vegan in most African cultures. But growing up in rural Kenya, it is only the elite who could afford meat, so Africans, especially the kind of people that I grew up with, they're vegan, even if they're not aware of it. And I mentioned in the book the fact that as I was writing it, I thought I was dying because I was not eating animal products, and I did not know that if you're vegan, you need to take vitamin B supplements. So they would do tests and it would show some similar kind of, like like I had cancer, because the symptoms are similar to a cancer. So, so the African society, in the cities, people still eat meat. In fact, the metaphors of political power is eating meat. You know, it's our time to eat. I think it's Michael Wrong, who has a title. It's our time to eat. It is, we are the ones in power, but that eating is eating meat. And it is usually the oppressive group that is seen as eating meat. So the veganism especially in the cities, is limited as a conscious choice. But in the rural areas, people are vegan even if they don't describe themselves as vegan. That's why I use the term vegan and conscious in the work. That these books may not be written from a vegan perspective, like Kuzie writes from a vegan perspective. But when Goge writes, it's not necessarily from a vegan perspective, but he suggests that the ideal will be when people stop killing animals and using animal products. Even in African, at the University of Nairobi, I had a lot of opposition. When I gave the manuscript to students to read, they were mocking me because now people think that plants also think, and it's true, there's some, they're sentient in a way. Shouldn't we just stop eating and die, go out of existence? Which I thought was an important question, but I argued that for the time being, at least we can get rid of meat as we think of an alternative for eating plants. But meat eating is still common. Nyama choma in Nairobi is still the kind of food that you find people eating in pubs. That usually the text presents the meat eaters as the oppressive class, while the ordinary people would not even be able to afford meat.
Thank you, Dr. Mwangi. Our next question. Thank you for your lovely and insightful talk. Can you speak a bit more about how the moral principle of Ubuntu?
Thank you. Yeah, then I should be careful what I'm going to say here. They were trying to say human in terms of the difference from animal, the Ubuntu from Ubulwane, the animalness. But later on, they started incorporating the environment. I think there's one I use called the Mutua, M-U-T-U-A, a South African Sagoma, who uses Ubuntu, but argues that animals are very much part of this Ubuntu. You also see it in novels such as Maru by Bessie Head, in which the animals have much more Ubuntu than human beings, especially because it's talking about, she's representing the discrimination, the exploitation of the so-called bushmen in Botswana. And the animals are much more friendly. They're much more human than the oppressive Botswana communities. So there's that, especially in the 21st century, emphasis Ubuntu should incorporate animal rights. Ubuntu should incorporate the environment. The controversy I mentioned that in the book, there was a controversy at UCT, University of Cape Town, in which the cafeteria started serving vegan food, and the Africans were against that. They thought that is a Western thing. The Africans always eat meat. But I argued, I don't know how South Africanists would respond to that those animal sacrifices that they used to justify the eating of meat were initially they initially involved the killing of human beings, but people change them into animals and they can change into something else. The Maasai rite of passage involved killing a lion. Like to be a man, you have to kill a lion. These days, they do not kill lions. It's actually protecting lions is part of becoming a man within the Maasai culture. They have looked for alternative ways of going through that rite of passage. The same thing with FGM. People do not necessarily have to cut the female body. They can do other kinds of rites of passage instead of these oppressive forms of self-fashioning. Thank you for that question.